Welcome to the Issam Faris Institute. My name is Leila Qabalan, and I'm the program coordinator for the social justice program. One of the things we're working on is actually affordable housing and right to the city, and this within a project called Social Justice and the City. So this falls under this project. I'm going to introduce Julia, and then she's going to be speaking for around 40 minutes, and then we'll open it for questions and answers. So Julia is an affiliated scholar actually here at the Issam Faris Institute, and she's a doctoral candidate in the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of California, Berkeley. For her dissertation, she's researching the Lebanese political economy. So this basically is one of the chapters in a bigger dissertation, and she's tracing circulations of capital through the banking and real estate sectors in an attempt to understand why so much money is flowing into Beirut despite all the political, economic, and regional insecurities. She comes from a professional background in emerging market finance at Wall Street and urban development at the World Bank. Julia also has a master's degree in urban planning, urban and regional planning from MIT. Her talk is titled Scarcity and Supply, Naturalizing the Political Economy of Real Estate Investment in Beirut. So please join me in welcoming Julia.
Thank you for coming, and thank you, Leila, for organizing. I met Leila 2 years ago when I was first thinking about my research. I presented at LAU, and she was asking me the most provocative questions that I actually went online, kind of stalked her, made sure I found her email, and we went out to lunch, and she's been such a source of knowledge for me over the past couple years.
Maybe so you can just put the microphone pointed towards you, the other one, no. The other one.
No.
So we can hear better. Yeah, there you go.
Is this good? Okay. Walking in Beirut, I have to keep my eyes down so as not to stumble over the architectures of security interwoven through its sidewalks and streets. There are high walls and rolls of barbed wire outside government buildings, armored vehicles arming the intersections when the cabinet's in session, and occasional military checkpoints blocking access to my street. But when I take my eyes off the street and look to the skyline, everywhere there are construction cranes erecting avant-garde apartments. These are evocative of affluence, or as one is written on one's walls, it's about the new Beirut, metropolitan, cosmopolitan, and expressive. It is this experience of negotiating Beirut's architectures of security while marveling at the ways the architectures of affluence also defy insecurity that inspired my dissertation. My research asks, why is so much money flowing into Lebanon despite the myriad risks of investing here? The past decade has witnessed assassinations, wars, and a refugee crisis, political tensions bordering on paralysis, and the mundane interruptions of electricity and water services, not to mention the piling putrid garbage. But nevertheless, Beirut is a construction site of high-rise towers advertised as luxurious, with an average price per square meter of more than $4,000. Meanwhile, the minimum wage is around $450 monthly. Investment in property implies a long-term position, one that's not easily as liquidated as less material financial investments in times of turbulence. But even as Lebanon descends deeper into political, economic, and occasional security crises, the construction of luxury apartment continues. This is one of the puzzles inspiring my dissertation. The solution to this puzzle, or at least the one put forward by developers, is the law of scarcity. Beirut is a city between the mountains and the sea. So given the natural allure and the nature of the fact that space is scarce, it's quite natural that Lebanese real estate is resilient against the myriad obstacles that would otherwise deter investment. The law of scarcity thus naturalizes the persistently high prices of property in a country that is otherwise in crisis, and an untold number of apartments remain empty. This is a city that endures when it comes to real estate, one developer told me. It is almost a universal economic law that investors will receive a handsome return on their investment in land. At last year's Lebanese Diaspora Energy Conference, another developer presented the price increases as an inevitable equation. In this talk, I want to counter this inevitability. Following on Marx and other political economists, economic laws, such as the law of scarcity, which are often understood as natural, are actually constructed. In Beirut, these universal laws are materialized in the built environment with the continuous construction of unaffordable apartments that everywhere sit empty. This talk traces the policies implemented since Reconstruction and reinforced as the repercussions of the Syrian civil war bleed across the border that have made this so. In tracing the narrative of the real estate market's resilience, I uncover the steps by which construction was perceived as a natural pillar of Lebanon's economy, and thus deconstruct its very resilience if the result, when one walks in Beirut in the evening and looks up at the darkened windows, is a city of uninhabited apartments because the resilient prices are beyond the reach of most residents. One of the meanings of to naturalize is to regard what is constructed to appear as natural. In other words, innate, unacquired, universal. The study of economics is often based on laws understood as natural, basically profit-maximizing behavior under conditions of scarcity. Thus, according to the law of scarcity, as the supply of a desired good, such as land in Beirut, is constrained, its price will naturally rise so long as demand is constant. Yet even the founder of free market economics, Adam Smith, who is cited for naturalizing economic laws led by the guidance of the invisible hand, never thought that self-regulating markets were a natural condition. Smith did not theorize a minimalist state, but actually set out several spheres for state intervention in order to countervail, not accommodate, capitalist interests. Although Marx believed that the capitalist class had conquered political sway in the modern state, his contribution was in uncovering the social relations disguised in commodity production, in turn undermining an understanding of capitalism as based on immutable laws of nature. However, most important for my argument is Karl Polanyi. He wrote of the emergence of the economy not as a state of nature, but as the separation of market exchange from the social relations in which it was originally embedded. Whereas the economy was once based on ties of reciprocity and redistribution, the economy in the 19th century came to be disembodied from society and markets became self-regulating. Thus, land for Polanyi was a fictitious commodity because land is simply nature and not produced for the purpose of sale. But with the economy's separation from society, the self-regulating market came to be seen as natural. Polanyi, however, denied there was anything natural about the self-regulating market. In his words, the road to the free market was opened and kept open by an enormous increase in continuous, centrally organized and controlled interventionism. However, these ideas of the market do not exist only in the realm of pure theory. Timothy Mitchell, for example, has applied them to the introduction of private property in colonial Egypt, wherein the political economy of Egypt was to be established, and I quote, on the basis of principles true in every country. The laws of private property were understood as universal, the very axiom of modern economics, without which exchange could not occur. Yet Timothy Mitchell reveals how the naturalization of private property as the origin of the modern economy was silent on the violence that produced it. So it's not that I want to denaturalize real estate as a pillar of the Lebanese economy. It's too obvious that its prominence was constructed by deliberate public policies. Rather, I want to trace the discourses around which real estate is understood to be resilient, specifically why Lebanese real estate is seen as a safe haven in a dangerous region and why its prices are said to never decline. In interviews with developers and bankers, its resilience is persuasively illustrated with the visual simplicity of an image. The snow-capped mountains surrounding Beirut on one side, the sparkling Mediterranean waters on the other. Simply, and following the law of scarcity, the limited supply of land means that prices will never go down. Descriptions such as this are said over and over again, such that the naturalization has taken on the status of fact. The immutable laws of economics, particularly of scarcity, are made absolute, almost on the level as the law of gravity, except in this case to ensure that the price of Lebanese real estate never goes down. Yet this resilience is not natural, it's constructed, naturally by those with a financial interest in continuing the policies that keep prices so high. If you ask almost any developer about the resiliency of the Lebanese real estate market, they will most likely respond with a simple explanation. The paradox of why prices seem to rarely fall despite the wars, assassinations, political corruption, paralysis, electricity blackouts, water shortages, uncollected garbage, is quite simply a question of the law of scarcity. Although properties supply is naturally constrained by geography, demand is ever rising due to population growth, the desire of expatriates to retain a foothold in their country of origin, and the enduring allure of Lebanon as a destination for investment from wealthy Arabs. The following excerpts from my interviews with developers, when I asked why real estate was an attractive investment in Lebanon, illustrate the picture well. This is one quote. "There are many reasons why real estate is an attractive investment for Lebanese who have a little bit of cash or a lot of cash. Let me tell you the basic grounds for this. Lebanon is 10,452 square kilometers. From this amount, you have some lands that are reserved for the clergy, and these lands you cannot build anything on them. And you have a big amount of lands reserved for agricultural purposes, and you have lands that are not fit for building. So you're left with a small amount of plots which will eventually go away, with the population growing, and with people buying. And then you have the Lebanese expats. You have around 3.9 million residents and 14.5 million Lebanese expats. Imagine if 1% of these 14.5 million wanted a house in Lebanon. You would be left with nothing, extremely nothing." Another quote. "Why is real estate a good investment in Lebanon? It's only 4,000 square miles, and half of Lebanon is owned by the government or the religious foundations, and most of this is mountains and valleys. Of the other half, 2,000 square miles, almost half is already built. What is left is 1,000 square miles that we were all fighting over. This brings us to land which is dear, and which nobody ever buys a plot of land in Lebanon and loses. This is why people are sitting on land banks and are considered very rich. Because of the scarcity of land, because of the climate, because of the way of life. The diaspora that is almost 15 to 20 million people around the world, of which at least 10 million are directly related to Lebanon. They have immediate family here. With such a small country, each one of them wants a house of their own." And a third quote from a developer. "It's not by magic that the market is retaining stabilized prices. It's because of one factor, which is the law of scarcity that governs our country. Sometimes we nag that we have a small country and a small market, but because it's a small market, a small country, it's our blessing. There is no magic. This is why you see the market respond to an increase in demand, but not respond to the decrease because of the scarcity of land. It is this certainty that the upward sloping supply curve will intersect with a downward sloping demand inexorably towards the upper and ever escalating into the price range that has taken on the status of a self-evident truth. One with even a basic understanding of economics would agree that the limited supply of land combined with enduring demand means that Lebanese real estate, so long as these constraints hold, will be expensive. These economic laws prevail over the conventional investment truism that most would evade investing in fixed assets, such as property, in times of turbulence and uncertainty, as today. So while bank deposits can be converted between currencies and transported across borders in only a keystroke, it's infinitely more complicated to cut one's money and run from a property market in which no one is purchasing, unless at a steep discount. But in the words of one developer, it is the simple law of scarcity that governs every single country that determines why discounts are unlikely in Lebanon. And so amid the many uncertainties facing the country, one certainty seems to be that real estate prices should never decrease. It is not uncommon for simplifications such as these to take hold. There is even some truth, of course, to the geographical facts that Lebanon is small, that Beirut's expansion is obstructed, and that expatriates and foreign investors appreciate the mountain and seaside views. Such discursive truths seem almost too sensible to question, even as the average price of an apartment in Beirut totaled more than $900,000 last year, when per capita income in Lebanon was about $10,000. The fact that the unrealistically high prices for property made no social sense is irrelevant when the law of scarcity is repeated so often that its reality partly comes into being by the very discourse describing it. This discourse of developers is also complemented by the metaphor of an ascending staircase, which is disseminated by Bank Audi. And I quote, from my interview there. As a matter of fact, in the past 20 years in Lebanon, real estate prices have followed a staircase scenario. They go up in a period of boom, then they stabilize, then they go up again and stabilize again in a slowdown period, but they don't decrease. It goes up and stabilize, it goes up and stabilize, it doesn't decrease. We don't have a real estate bubble in Lebanon. There is no bubble in Lebanon, and this is one of the reasons why prices don't decrease. We have strong fundamentals for the real estate market, and these are due to three major factors. These factors, as elucidated by Bank Audi's real estate reports and by their author in our interview, are 1, the non-speculative demand, 2, the lack of leverage, and 3, the scarcity of land. First, speculators are said to only account for 20% of the market. When the market was on the ascending side of the staircase in 2009, Bank Audi estimated that 50% of the demand was from residents, 40% from Gulf Arab. 50% of the demand was residents, 40% from expats, and 5 to 10% Gulf Arabs. Even today, on the flat part of the staircase, as Gulf Arab investment has vanished and expatriate purchases are on hold, Bank Audi's research economists underlined the market's organic growth based on the fact that there are 15,000 new households being formed in Lebanon each year. The second reason real estate prices don't go down is that developers are said not to be significantly leveraged because they rely on their own financing or on pre-sales, meaning that they do not have to pay back the bank money, so thus they don't have to decrease their prices. Third, because the land parcels are ever shrinking, their prices are said to be stable even in slower years such as today. So thus, I see the staircase as a spiral one because it returns back to the law of scarcity to determine why prices remain high, even though apartments remain empty. Lebanese real estate is often described, and I quote, as a safe haven in an otherwise dangerous region, and not only by developers with an interest in such description. In a report on the foreign capital inflows that fuel Lebanon's economy, the World Bank recognized, and I quote, real estate as a safe haven in a volatile environment. These capital inflows were especially related to the region's oil wealth, and in turn invested in Lebanese real estate and bank deposits, which, again quoting, are considered safe havens in times of crisis. This was not necessarily a positive depiction, as the World Bank went on to argue that the misallocation of capital inflows into real estate assets had distorted the economic development towards a non-productive direction. They estimated that between 1997 and 2012, real estate acquisitions accounted for anywhere between 50 and 70% of all physical assets in Lebanon, which in their words suggested, quoting, real estate and construction became directly and indirectly the main determinant of economic activity in Lebanon. Figures from the Central Administration of Statistics also testify to the importance of real estate and construction in the Lebanese economy. In the past decade, agriculture has averaged around 3% of the economy, manufacturing 7%, financial services also 7%, with real estate and construction together accounting for around 20% of the economy. These data reflect what was often reiterated in my interviews, which was that unless one deposits their capital in a bank, there's very little else to invest in Lebanon besides real estate. Historical research on the Lebanese political economy, such as Carolyn Gates's book, The Merchant Republic, reveals that property development has long been a store of value and an attraction of foreign investment. 2/3 of all investment in the decade before the Civil War went into construction, concentrated primarily in apartments in and around Beirut. During the war's hyperinflationary years, land was seen as a safer way to store money, and I'm often told today that people still consider property the only safe investment in the country. Thus, beyond being a safe haven in a dangerous region, real estate is also a pillar of the Lebanese economy, and post-war policies also constructed it so. In Beirut, it's often said that more buildings were demolished during Reconstruction than were destroyed during the war. Solidaire transformed all property in the city center into stocks, converted all property owners into shareholders, and turned the government into a shareholder in the largest private company in the building industry, which in turn was charged with overseeing Reconstruction. Indeed, I could write an entire dissertation almost entirely about Solidaire, but this has been done many times over, so I'll focus instead on the foreign, Arab, and expat investment in the Lebanese real estate sector, as well as its financialization, both through real estate investment funds and the rise of a mortgage market in Lebanon. Reconstruction was more than just rebuilding, but also inducing investment back to Beirut. Consonant with its pre-war financial prowess, Hariri's proclaimed objective was to turn Lebanon into, I quote, the Singapore of the Middle East. And upon becoming prime minister, he set about stabilizing the currency and rebuilding the infrastructure essential to remake Beirut into a regional financial center. This started with the infusion of Gulf Arab and expatriate capital into Solidaire. Between 1990 and 1995, an estimated 80% of all property investments came from Lebanese expats and investors from Saudi Arabia and the UAE. According to a law set out in 1969, foreigners were required to make an application to the Ministry of Finance to purchase property, and non-Arab nationals also required a decree from the cabinet. But given the need for foreign investment, in 2001, Parliament passed legislation to ease controls over foreign ownership, which enabled foreigners to own up to 3,000 square meters of property without the consent of the Ministry of Finance or Cabinet. Arab investment then rose like a specter over the Lebanese property market. Although tourists from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, and Qatar often visited the mountains in the pre-war years, their post-war return was imperative for the luxury market, which is ever more constructed around their affluence. The repercussions of September 11th also attracted more Gulf investment into Lebanon, not only because of its banking secrecy law, but also because of the allure of its property market. Seen with suspicion in the US and Europe, Gulf investment was welcomed by Lebanese bankers and property developers. In the year after 9/11, foreign investment from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait constituted half of all investment in Lebanon. That year, 2002, an estimated 1 billion of seafront apartments were sold in Beirut, with the financing from these developments and their buyers mostly coming from the Gulf. The Park View Apartments, for example, which is one of the earliest luxury buildings in Solidaire, was virtually empty before September 2001, but 1 year later, 70% of the apartments had been sold to Gulf Arabs. The property market's most prosperous years were between 2004 and 2010. Despite Hariri's assassination in 2005, the July 2006 war, despite the downtown protests between late 2006 and May 2008, despite the armed clashes between Hezbollah and their political opponents in May 2008, property prices continued climbing. The signing of the Doha Accord in May 2008 brought political stability and in turn brought property prices to ever higher levels. Even after the Dubai property bubble had burst and the rest of the world was mired in financial crisis, Lebanon's banking sector was saturated in deposits, which rose more than 20% in 2009 alone. Between 2003 and 2010, the average price of a square meter of real estate in Beirut rose by more than 300%. If real estate is a long-term investment and thus premised on long-term expectations, then the ever-escalating price of property is puzzling against this relatively risky backdrop of Lebanon's recent history. Part of this paradox can be explained by the rising price of oil, which increased from around $28 in 2003 to over $100 in 2013. The World Bank has correlated the foreign financial flows into Lebanon strongly and positively with the price of oil, with a 1% increase, with a 1% increase in oil prices between 2002 and 2010, leading to 2/3 of a percentage point increase in bank deposits in Lebanon. Gulf investors were behind many of the most expensive developments in Lebanon during this period, with the July war seen as a temporary setback to the sector's otherwise interrupted growth. Another significant source of foreign investment were Lebanese expats. There were an estimated 500,000 Lebanese living in the Gulf in 2009, and since they were close enough for weekend visits, many purchased second homes back in Lebanon. From my archival research, I found that while Gulf nationals were emphasized as investors until around 2005, with the withdrawal of Syrian troops, more expats were thought to be investing back in Lebanon. After the July War, when many Gulf projects, such as the Phoenician Village, the Damak Tower, and the Beirut Gate, were paused, as their Emirati and Kuwaiti financiers waited to see how political developments would unfold, Lebanese expats kept investing as they understood the subtleties of the political situation. And as the expatriate investor and purchaser came to prominence, so too did investment facilities focused on real estate. The traditional Lebanese developer was known for bringing his or his friends and family's money to a project, not relying on bank loans and pre-selling most of the project, sometimes even before they bought the land. However, with prices and profits rising and many expats returning after working in investment banking abroad, there arose a different type of developer driven by the financials of property development, primarily the internal rate of return. The IRR is a tool to measure the profit potential of an investment. Because it's measured over a fixed period of time, the faster the money is returned. In other words, the more quickly the apartments sell, the higher the IRR and the more profitable the project is. Mena Capital was the first of these many property investment firms. It was founded by a former investment banker with J.P. Morgan who returned to Lebanon in 1994 to form a regional investment bank. But since there was little to invest in besides property, he moved Mena Capital's focus to property development. Another example of this new developer was CGI, founded in the late 1990s by the Saradad Group, and since they've been purchased by Bank Audi, who today own 19% of this property development company. The synergies of this connection, according to their chief executive officer, are that CGI can structure opportunities and attract capital from the clients of Bank Audi. These clients are usually Lebanese expatriates who purchase shares between $500,000 and $5 million in a particular project, and it is then managed like a fund in that CGI makes the decisions and returns their investment upon exiting the project. With this focus on maximizing the IRR, the lines between property development and financial profit are not only blurred, but indistinguishable. The metaphor of the ascending staircase is supposed to explain why property prices never fall, at least not perceptibly. Prices rise, as they did from 2003 to 2010, and they stabilize, as they have afterwards. The flat part of the staircase coincides with the start of the Syrian civil war and Lebanon's prolonged period of political paralysis. The understanding has been that politics is the reason for the market stagnation, although real estate prices have really only declined by around 2% in the past 5 years. However, according to Bank Biblo's index, real estate demand was at its lowest levels in 2015. In the words of their research economist, the property sector is not stable or stagnating, this is marketing, namely on the part of those with vested interests. His reference was the bank behind the staircase metaphor. Meanwhile, Bank Audi's real estate report for 2005 predicted the value of sales transactions would decrease that year by 15%. The reason for the crisis, in Bank Audi's words, is that, and I quote, the domestic realty market has been caught in the midst of regional turmoil, starting with the Arab Spring revolutions and escalating with the Syrian conflict. This caused Gulf investors to exit and Lebanese expats to withhold investment while they waited to see the extent to which the regional turmoil would destabilize Lebanon. When once Bank Audi portrayed the property market as a safe haven in a dangerous region, they now describe it as prey to contentious politics. The Lebanese real estate sector is no longer resilient to adverse political and security conditions. Instead of being a safe haven, Bank Audi writes, and I quote, "The property market activity and prices now remain more than ever tied to the evolution of the security and investment climate in the country, and there are quite few uncertainties in this respect." Politics is at the forefront of everything that is wrong with the real estate sector, according to the developers with whom I spoke. One with Majid Al Futtaim, an Emirati firm and also the largest foreign investor in Lebanon, emphasized that the politics of the Syrian conflict could not be disentangled from Lebanon's own political impasse, which was deadlocking institutions. Another problem, according to the developers, was the departure of Gulf Arabs, with their government's travel warnings against Lebanon, as well as the hesitation on the part of expats who are waiting to see how political developments will unfold. My interviews with developers often deteriorated into amateur geopolitical analysis, with the chairman of Meta Capital predicting the outcome of the Syrian war negotiations in Vienna, and the promoter of SEMA Beirut expecting more interest after the Iranian nuclear negotiations. Another developer, who was quoted in Lebanon Opportunities in 2012 as foreseeing a renewed real estate boom with the regime change in Syria, when I interviewed him last year said, and I quote, "I don't like to call it a crash, but I don't see the end of it. I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel." One of the only hopes among many of the developers with whom I spoke was the immense amount of money they were expecting to make from reconstruction in Syria. But another hope stems from the Banque de Lebaon's economic stimulus plan, which not only sustains real estate prices through this difficult time, but also sees the sector through its own cyclical correction that has little to do with the Syrian war. Although through stimulus packages of around $1 billion annually since 2013, the Banque de Lebaon has provided a floor to an otherwise stagnating economy. Although real estate and construction account for around 20% of Lebanon's economy, they receive 56% of the stimulus resources, totaling more than $2 billion in the past 4 years. The stimulus has steered the Lebanese economy and the real estate market, as they are co-constitutive, away from the crisis facing the country with the negative spillovers from Syria, or as one developer emphasized, and I quote, "If it wasn't for the stimulus, our sector would be in deep shit. It's as simple as that." The stimulus works by allowing more than 30 Lebanese banks that offer Banque de Lebaon's subsidized loans to borrow from the central bank at 1% and on lend to their borrowers at around 5.5%, several percentage points lower than the average lending rate. The maximum loan amount is 800 million Lebanese pounds, which is around $530,000. Loans are available to both Lebanese residents and expats with a minimum down payment of 25%, though it's sometimes slightly higher for expats. And the loans are generally payable over 20 to 30 years. To avoid speculators and to support primary home ownership, under the stimulus, it's prohibited to sell your property for 7 years after the issuance of a loan, or else the borrower must pay a penalty of 2% of the outstanding loan amount. Although the mortgage payments cannot exceed 1/3 of the borrower's salary, the subsidies are thought to mainly benefit the middle classes, given the high price of property, which even with a mortgage is beyond the reach of many residents. Yet by capping the loan size, the stimulus is directed more in towards smaller apartments, not the large, luxurious ones that previously drove the real estate sector. Although the stimulus is meant to counteract the recent downturn, it is in line with past measures to build a mortgage market in Lebanon. According to an economist with whom I interviewed, Lebanon's long-term debt market was non-existent before the past 2 decades because banks were obsessed, in his words, with balancing short-term liquidity with deposits that were necessarily also short-term. In his words, and I quote, "This restriction has relaxed over the years and people have become more adapted to carrying debt. We are not used to carrying debt for many years, but the banks have become used to that and they are actually encouraging them to plunge into the real estate market," end quote. Delving back into the archives, I learned that the International Finance Corporation assisted Lebanese banks to structure their first mortgages back in 1997. Until the IFC program, the only credit available to home buyers was from developers. The buyers would sign contracts for properties still in works, deposit a sizable payment with developers, and promise to pay the balance back in timely installments before construction was completed. This process essentially financed the developer's cost of construction, but it provided little assurance to purchasers with no guarantee that they would get an apartment. The IFC program involved $100 million invested in 6 Lebanese banks, which in turn provided housing loans from 7 to 15 years, with interest rates back then averaging between 10 and 12%. There was also a loan ceiling, also a minimum income requirement, and demand was so great for these mortgages that within several months, the IFC issued a second tranche of $100 million to 10 Lebanese banks. It is interesting to note that this first housing loan program in the late 1990s also occurred during a downturn in the property cycle, which in echoes of recessions to come, thousands of unsold apartments stood empty in Beirut. Thereafter, the Banque de Lebanon implemented their first subsidized mortgages in late 2009, coinciding with the global financial crisis amid fears of negative repercussions for the Lebanese economy. Back under this first program, there was no maximum ceiling on loan amounts, one aspect that has been changed under the current stimulus. In an interview I had with an official at the Banque de Lebanon, he acknowledged the problems of focusing the stimulus so exclusively on the property sector, as so few citizens were actually employed in construction. But he said that one of their aims was to promote long-term lending, and mortgages were the only viable means of doing so. Moreover, in his words, and I quote, "The ultimate indicator for the economy, construction was the ultimate indicator for the economy. If you have confidence in the economy, you have a lot of construction. If less confidence, then less investment in construction." His words point to the very difficult position faced by the Banque de Lebanon of having to support property development in order to prop up the entire economy. The stimulus thus aims to stimulate the economy in general by stimulating the real estate sector in particular. Thus, the question to be asked is to what extent Lebanese policymakers have any other choice but to ensure that profits keep flowing into the pockets of property developers in order to stay in the broader economy. The stimulus provides a floor below which prices cannot collapse, but perhaps developers are becoming dependent on this floor. Because in my walks around the city, I continue to see construction cranes scattered across Beirut's skyline in neighborhoods where apartments are still priced beyond the means of the majority. Moreover, one of the 3 pillars of the property staircase, in addition to scarcity and the absence of speculation, is that developers are thought to be relatively unleveraged. Yet all the developers I interviewed acknowledged depending somewhat on bank loans. And today, personal mortgages comprise 17% of all bank credits. In fact, in 2014, the size of the mortgage market was for the first time overtook construction loans at almost $10 billion annually. Thus, as the Banque de Lebanon attempts to counteract the overall economic slowdown by stimulating property sales, they are not only reinforcing the economy's dependence on ongoing construction, but also drawing an ever-increasing proportion of the population into this dependence via personal housing loans. The property sector is an undeniably important pillar of the economy, and thus it comprises an unsurprisingly important component of the stimulus. But this is public policy supporting the staircase of property prices, not the natural resiliency of real estate. To summarize, the resiliency of the real estate market, both property's high prices and its place as an economic pillar, is constructed through public policy. The natural scarcity of land in Beirut, nestled between the mountains and the sea, does not ensure that it can evade the nature of supply and demand. For there is another economic law that developers rarely mention, the law which states that an oversupply of anything, including apartments, should translate into a decrease in price until the supply meets the demand. But there is an abundance of empty apartments in Beirut, which even without official statistics is indisputable, with darkened windows everywhere, from the luxury towers along the Corniche to the elegant apartments around Solidaire, or even the soaring Skygate, which I can see from my veranda. Over this course of observing Skygate in the evenings from my apartment, Skygate, where apartments sell for $2 million starting on the bottom floor. Since its opening 8 months ago, I've rarely seen more than 1 or 2 apartments with any lights on. although of course this is hardly a scientific method. Polanyi argued that the economy cannot be detached from society, and so too can the importance of property not be disconnected from the policies that place it there. Today, as prices maintain their resilience in spite of the economic slowdown, the question becomes, at what cost? This resiliency comes at a price, and not only the cost of an apartment that is beyond the reach of all but the most privileged, but also the unquantifiable consequences on a city of uninhabited apartment buildings. Beirut is not empty, but it is fragmented into spaces of affluence and exclusion. As property has become a storage of value, divorced from its use as a place to live, entire swaths of the city have become denied to many. Although an untold number of apartments are unoccupied, their expense is forcing many home buyers to the periphery and into hours of commuter traffic. The construction cranes linger over unfinished building sites, awaiting political stability and more prosperous times. Their boarded walls advertise luxurious accommodations and amenities when water shortages and electricity blackouts for many residents of Beirut are daily occurrences. It's not simply sectarianism or insecurity dividing Beirut into separate enclaves, but an unaffordability propped up by policies that are keeping so many apartment windows darkened, their buildings uninhabited, creating, at least in my opinion, a rather unnatural feeling of emptiness for any resident in Beirut when the property sector is said to be such a natural component of the economy. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Julia. That was really good. We're going to open it up for questions. So maybe we'll take 2, and then we'll do 3, and then where to start? Yeah.
I really thank you for the wonderful presentation, and hope that once you've published your dissertation on work, you turn it into some sort of book for the entire public to read. It's a wonderful piece. But throughout your presentation, I've noticed one main issue, and please do take this as a friendly suggestion or comment. I noticed that you have not come across any mention of redistributive taxation, and that this is a major issue when it comes to the housing sector in Lebanon, and especially land, because we do know for a fact that many well-landed individuals and well, I don't know much about corporations, but at least well-landed individuals can own up to 20 and 30 and tens of land parcels without having to pay any annual or regular taxes on those land parcels. And when you have that, then it no longer becomes a cycle in which affordable housing can be provided to the entire Lebanese population, because you have no redistributive taxation that allows for more equality in the land sector. That was the friendly comment. And as to my question, I wonder whether you've looked into the possibility of studying the migration, the effect of the migration patterns or different Lebanese diaspora and communities on their preferences and tastes. So I wonder whether you've studied whether, let's say, the Lebanese population in the Gulf prefer more luxury apartments as opposed to, let's say, the Lebanese diaspora in Europe or North America or elsewhere. That's it.
Thank you.
Straightforward question. I wonder if you computed the factor of the average price of apartments in Lebanon or Beirut in relation to the average income, that factor, and compare it to other cities, for example, Los Angeles, so we know at least the sheer scale of or the magnitude of the crisis.
Thanks, Julia. That was excellent. I think it's a good start to kind of begin to understand sometimes a really complex situation in a place like Beirut and Lebanon. The complexities sometimes aren't easily researchable, And one of them that I think, you know, is missing and might not be easily to get at is the issue of money laundering in Lebanon. And so it's kind of an elephant in the room to a certain degree, but it's also something that's not easy to get at. So I wanted to just ask to see if, since it wasn't mentioned in your presentation, I'm not familiar with how you get at numbers or estimations, but it would be interesting to hear about money laundering, specifically in real estate.
Yes, actually, I cited some on the first question on taxation. I completely agree that that's also a public policy that is keeping prices where they are. I cite Professor Jad Chaban's work. He's looked at this. There's also another policy around, the building law and how that also supports the construction as it is. And again, I cite previous work done on this. I completely agree, and I should probably do more on taxation in my dissertation. On the effect of migration patterns on preferences and tastes, I've really just heard anecdotal reports. Actually, I've heard that a lot of people, expats coming from the Gulf, are looking more at smaller apartments. But again, I'm hearing this from developers, that they're thinking they can sell their apartments because they're really good weekend apartments. People who've been in Europe or the United States are much more used to having smaller apartments, and so this could also be a way to stimulate the selling of smaller apartments. And then, as I'm sure many of you know, you drive throughout Lebanon, and you're in this totally rural area, and you come across these McMansions, and they're totally fantastically and creatively built. And I know a lot of that money is a lot of that construction is coming from expats, and I've been told that, for example, the expats based in Africa bring a lot of those building traditions back here to Lebanon, but again, this is all anecdotal, so I don't know a lot about that. On the average price of apartments versus per capita income, it's a really good idea, and I should do that because one thing I think is important to keep in mind, for example, based out of Berkeley. San Francisco, apartments are not affordable there either. London, prices are outrageous. So we shouldn't just look at Beirut. Beirut is not necessarily unique in that regard. There is something, especially with foreign money going into real estate worldwide, that I think is making certain cities just outrageously expensive. I can cite right here, Charbel Nahas spoke at AUB's city debates a couple years ago. He computed this, and he found that compared to the minimum wage, the price of a square meter of apartment is, let me see, compared to the, I'll give you the statistics afterwards, but he looked at this for some cities in France, and he showed that Lebanon was much, much more expensive compared to Marseille and Lyon in terms of minimum wage. So Lebanon could be distinct in this way, but I would like to look at like San Francisco and London, cities which are known worldwide for being outrageous. So I will do that and add it to this chapter. Thank you. On money laundering, yes, I've heard, in many of my interviews, I was sitting at the Phoenicia Hotel, and I was interviewing an expat who is a developer in his home country. And he just went off on how, and he was pointing to all these buildings, that this is money laundering. A lot of the increases in prices happened in the mid-2000s, right after the Iraq War. A lot of money exited Iraq at that time. This is something that I would love to research. I don't know if I can, as my first project in Lebanon or as a foreigner, I'm necessarily the one qualified to do that, since there's a lot of information I'm not told. My last chapter is looking at the implications of the US Congress's Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act and the risks that could entail for the Lebanese banking sector. So I am looking at money laundering and terrorism financing, or more specifically, the power of the discourse of who can say who's money laundering, who's doing the terrorism financing, and the power of the dollar to thus determine that. But if I had a way to research more into money laundering, I definitely would, because it has come up all the time. Some of the developers that I have interviewed have been implicated in money laundering overseas. You can Google it and find out who, but particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, developers who did projects there have been cited, at least by the FBI, for money laundering. So it's definitely a concern.
Okay, we can go for another round of questions. One in the back, yeah.
Just a question, and I came in a little late, sorry. But when you had mentioned the kind of conventional wisdom that developers aren't leveraged at all, the central bank passed a circular in like October or November of 2015 allowing for debt restructuring, which again, anecdotally, I had heard that developers were very happy to have that circular out. I was just wondering if you kind of talked to them at all about that.
I have not heard of that circular, so thank you for that information. I will look into it. Thank you, Matt. Oh, hi.
So I dearly hope that you will have a chance to quote Jeremy's very well researched story on the Hezbollah Financing Act. It's currently our cover in Executive Magazine. And in the meanwhile, while we wait for your dissertation and your book publication, if anybody needs to look at the more journalistic takes on the real estate story over the last years, we have a lot of the quotes by the people like George Shevane and Fawaz and the others that are somehow reverberating through your slides.
All of my information, which I'm reading out loud so I'm not citing it, a lot of it comes from Lebanon Opportunities in the Executive. I went back through their archives. It's a treasure trove of information. So
But just to mention that point about the feedback, as you said, it is very unreliable in the sense that the developers have A, vested interests, and B, very anecdotal evidence. But what they have been saying is that the Lebanese expats have moved increasingly away from external factors such as reputation of a street or ancestral links to whoever lived in that village, to saying, okay, where is it good for traffic, where is it good for building quality, where are schools, the more conventional ways of assessing value. One last thing that I would ask about is how much of the distortions of the rental market you would be able to integrate into the overall look at the prices, which are 80+% driven by sales prices and not really reflecting the actual cost of living for the non-expats or the non-foreign workers that live in Beirut. So the whole condition, in our building we have seen that 2 apartments out of 8 have been converted into single dwelling units where people go and rent $400 or $500 a month for a room, where before the whole apartment was rented out as maximum $900. So a conversion of dwellings under basically avoidance of the current laws, but tolerated because of the restrictions on the sector, how much that could play into the whole price dynamic and cost of living dynamic.
Do we have any more questions? Yes, we did.
I might have missed this too, but did you look into also the support, that the sector gets from, let's say, conflict of interest between politicians who are investors and the laws that they pass that allow for bigger exploitation areas, built-up areas? We've seen the coastline of Beirut, we've seen daily, we've seen changing of laws several times to increase ratios. So how do we quantify that kind of support? And also, if one was to ask about this question, everybody talks about the number of lights on in a tower. And I've said what you've said a million times. So is there any way that we can actually get a figure on the number of empty apartments in Beirut? And have you gone about trying to do that? And what are the answers you've gotten, or what are the ways of doing that? And what would be the way of doing that in another city, for example, that we should try, or what kind of information would be available?
Thank you for coming. I really loved your work as well.
Thank you.
Your report. So there's another PhD candidate. She is going to be defending in a couple weeks Marieke. I can't always pronounce her last name. She's Dutch. She is knows actually so much more about real estate in Lebanon than I do. And she is looking at the conflict of interest issues that you and Matt, the executive, have also looked at. So I'm not looking at that because that's her territory, and she's years ahead of me on that. I'm trying to look at real estate is just one chapter. I'm really trying to look at the overall economy of Lebanon, and in a way be able to make it interesting for people who don't necessarily know Lebanon or know Lebanon in terms of, I don't know, Hezbollah, and that's what they know. And I want to put Lebanon in as like an economic case study that normalizes it but abnormalizes it in a way. So I feel like by getting into a lot of the politics, it makes it really hard for, let's say, I used to work in Brazil, someone who's based out of Brazil and wants to learn from the Lebanese case, but Marique's work is doing that, and I think if she's defending in a few weeks, her dissertation should be public soon. She's also done work on the building law. The second part of your question, sorry, was? Empty apartments. I've cited in my chapter, and I can look it up, different figures that I found over the past couple years, but it's all very much like, a developer, like Masad Ferez said this. So I went to Lebanon Opportunities there. In November, they had a conference. I went to the real estate thing, and there was like a huge discussion about how many empty apartments there are, and there just isn't a figure, which in some ways is great for me because I really don't like quantitative stuff, so I can, if there's no number, there's no number. But there isn't a number. I know that there's been work by urban planning master's students here to do a sort of like, take a few city blocks and then count empty windows, count dark windows several times, and then how much they can extrapolate from that. But there isn't a figure, and I almost wonder how much not being a figure is almost intentional. Because having these numbers could be against certain people's interests. And so often, like, the lack of statistics is a problem, but sometimes it's intentionally a problem sometimes. At least that's my perspective.
Would anyone keep those numbers, though? I mean, or would those numbers not be tabulated by anyone, anywhere? Like the government's real estate office, whatever they call that place?
I don't know how to find those numbers.
The real estate developers don't know how to find those numbers, and they have been moaning. I mean, I totally could corroborate that when Mr. Fares comes out, he will first tell us, oh, there are so and so many empty luxury level newly completed apartments that would represent a value of X based on an assumption of Y, which is, and then when you challenge him on it and try to corroborate it, it's no, it's just an estimate. So there is nobody at this stage who has actually undertaken the research, and as far as the cadastre is concerned, we are very much, let's say, happy to see that they cannot provide us with anything that really matters in terms of either rental occupation or rental income or sub-rentals or ownership occupied or anything, because that's still the best, the most cherished secret when it comes to the Lebanese construction and real estate entire sector, if I am not wrong there.
Any other sector, it's a politics of oblivion. I mean, the numbers are missing.
Not entirely in every other sector. but in real estate, definitely as one of the top sectors.
Just I want to point out that the number of uninhabited apartments is not an indication of whether they are purchased or not, because a large number have been purchased before the crisis and for speculation or for just investment. So a lot of the apartments are actually owned by Gulf, people from the Gulf or expats, but they just don't live here. So it's an indication of something else, not mixing between if it's inhabited or if it's purchased. Those are two different things. So counting the lights is not a good indicator of this.
I totally agree. And there's also, I mean, there's Issam Ashkar, I think he's arguing in a piece that this whole downturn of the real estate market, which is now blamed on Syria and Lebanon's own domestic political issues, it's actually a cyclical problem. It's that they focused for too long on building large apartments and they just ran out of buyers. It happens to coincide with Syria and Lebanon's lack of a president, but it's a convenient excuse to blame this on politics. It's really a market correction. I think that that's important to point out.
Building on the question about taxation earlier, have you had a chance to look, or do you think there's actually anything about the non-taxed but equivalent co-op fees that many people in multi-unit buildings would be expected to pay? And if you live outside and you're not paying, there's, to the best of my understanding, very little possibility that you're going to be held to account, except for informal pressure from neighbors because maybe people don't want to take anybody to court or it's a messy, long process. And I'm wondering if that's actually a reason that there's less incentive for people to sell an apartment that realistically they have no intention of really ever inhabiting.
Yeah.
I wonder if the real estate market, especially the price trends, can be used also as a proxy for inequality trends. Meaning, because you have people, despite the valuable increase in prices, people still live in houses in Lebanon like anywhere else. So I wonder if, for example, people had to move outside the city to buy more affordable houses, while inside the city you had other people that inequality made more richer than the others buying the houses in the city. So for a long time I was wondering about how, because inequality rates are not measured in a reliable way in many countries, especially in Middle Eastern countries. And I wonder if Lebanon or anywhere else you think it's possible, out there, it's possible to use them to know how, since you cannot know what they own, you can know how much they spend for their houses. And because you have aggregate data now for the average increase in price. Probably the areas that increase a lot, the areas that or either decrease or increase just a little bit, and that the gap can give you the inequality.
Just a little question. In addition to the uninhabited apartments, there is a significant amount of abandoned houses and real estate that hasn't been claimed for different reasons. Part of it has to do with inheritance. Part of it has to do with the fact that people after the war didn't come back, or there's all sorts of issues that make that particular issue also very complicated. Part of it is also the inability of the Lebanese state to have laws that kind of clarify ownership, and so it's pretty complicated. But at the same time, there's a significant amount of abandoned houses and land that hasn't been claimed. I don't know. I realize that real estate is going to be one part of your work, but it would be something that would be interesting to look into, also very complicated to look into if somebody's just looking at land ownership and real estate inheritance in Lebanon.
Yeah, property disputes. Yeah, I mean, I think there's at least a couple anthropologists who are doing like ethnographies of abandoned buildings, or, abandoned and an ethnography of the building and maybe even the people who pass in and out of it and who are living. I could get you their names. I met them over a drink last week, so I'm not really sure. But I will get you their names. Maybe, is it Samar, she's at OIB, Hanafi, maybe is her name? I can, on real estate as a proxy for inequality, yeah, that would be fascinating. First thing is getting the numbers. I think the last GDP statistics I found from Lebanon was 2012, and now it's 2016, so it's conveniently like 4 years late. So I've actually been using, it's really hard in my research to decide whose numbers I'm going to believe, because if I want to take the most current numbers, I can't take the official statistics. So do I take the IMF? Do I take the World Bank? Like, they've been all over the place oftentimes. And inequality also, as you mentioned, being measured in many different ways than just income. I mean, inequality in terms of traffic commutes would be, that's a source of inequality. More and more people are having to move out to the periphery and spend hours in traffic. That is a measure of inequality that I think that's a very good point. And I think that's something I'm hopefully trying to bring in, like, also qualitatively to how I write about this, since the quantitative often escapes me, both how my mind works and how the statistics are presented here and not presented here. But that was one of the things that inspired my dissertation, was that I felt that not only this feeling of walking around and seeing like the darkened windows, whether or not they're inhabited or owned by expats or not, I mean, it creates a very eerie feeling. And I've had several friends come up, tell me how they feel that so much of the city is not theirs anymore. And, we'll walk around downtown and they'll tell me about how they used to have like Sunday lunch at a certain restaurant, and it's just like the restaurant closes, it can't support customers, and even worse over the past year. And it's like a qualitative feeling of like inequality and deprivation that I'm trying to bring in. Like, what does it mean to live in a city of not abandoned, but just empty apartments, especially not over the summer? And it's interesting. I went back to read, like, in the 1960s, there was an article on immigration from Lebanon, because it's been a trend. It's not just recent. And anthropologists called, the village, it's a graveyard of houses, because so many people had to leave and go make money overseas. And so immigration is a huge topic in my research, about how people have to leave to come back here to make money, to flow money in, and that's what keeps this economy so resilient. But my whole research is asking, like, what cost is resiliency? Like, yes, the real estate market is hell, but there's a tremendous cost to that. Yes, banking deposits keep coming in, but at what cost? The cost that most of the graduates are going to have to go overseas to work. It's a tremendous cost.
Quantitative capture is better, the whys and hows.
And on your question on, like, informal, like, co-op payments, that's another thing to add. I don't know anything about that. So.
Do we have any more questions or comments?
Just be careful of lit windows in new developments. It's a safe strategy nowadays.
Be careful of what?
Of lit windows in new developments. It's a safe strategy.
Very easy to put
they're still empty, but they're lit.
They tend not to wash the windows on the same frequency, so...
That's the new technique. They're using the night in their advantage.
Well, on that note.
But not only in Beirut. The tallest building in Amman, I walked by there and I saw everything lit, and I know.
And it's dirty.
They are all dirty windows, yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending. The talk will be online, both in audio and video, within 24 hours if you want to refer back to it. Please stay updated for our social justice and the city events. And thanks, Julia, and thanks everyone for attending.
And if you want to contact me about my research, I'm sorry I didn't put my email up here, but you can just Google me. I'm very easily found online.